Well, good afternoon, everyone. We've got a full house here on this bright, sunny spring day. Yay, spring has arrived. Antonia, you brought spring with you. Today, we're pleased to welcome one of our CCOVI Fellows, Antonia Mantonakis. Dr. Mantonakis is an associate professor of marketing in the Goodman School of Business, but also an associate in the Department of Psychology here at Brock University. A psychologist by training, her Bachelor of Science she attained in psychology from the University of Toronto, then went on to get an MA in experimental cognitive psychology from Simon Fraser University. And then, of course, that still wasn't enough, so went on with her PhD in experimental cognitive psychology from Simon Fraser University. So her wine research is conducted here at Brock, but at one of CCOVI's off-site facilities. It's the Consumer Perception and Cognitive Laboratory that's just down the hill. And it focuses on the psychological factors that affect consumer behavior and consumer decision making. So big, important part of the value chain of the research that we do here at the Institute. When Antonia is not teaching or working on her research using, the concept of both sides of the brain, Antonia can be found teaching Zumba classes here at Brock. So today she's going to talk to us about consumer perceptions, the influence of subtle label changes on consumer behavior. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank you all for coming, and those of you watching online, thanks for joining us today. I want to start by asking you all a question. So just raise your hand if you want to participate. What are the factors that you think, other than the price, influences a consumer's perception of the quality of a wine? So other than price, what are some factors? Yes?
Recommendation from friends.
A recommendation from a friend, okay? There's another hand.
Awards.
If it's won an award or not, right. Anything else? Yes?
Label, year of made.
The vintage, the year, any other factors associated with the label. Very good. So these are all marketing related variables that you've brought up that could be associated with the promotion or the presentation of the wine. So if a wine has won an award, for instance, that might be, the winemaker might decide to communicate that to consumers. And it's these kinds of marketing related variables that I'm interested in studying in my research. And some of the research that I've looked at, I'm just going to go through a few of my recent studies to show some of the things that make a difference in what a consumer chooses, which may or may not have a validity to it. So it might be something that's more incidental that can influence consumer decision making. So one of the things is the order in which a wine is presented. So imagine going to a tasting room and you show the first Riesling, you taste the second Riesling, and so on, or a product consultant at the LCBO shows the first Cabernet Merlot or suggests the second Cabernet Merlot, and so on. Well, what we've shown in research that we did at our Consumer Perception and Cognition Laboratory is that when consumers come in to sample a set of Rieslings, for instance, the order in which they taste the wine can have an influence on which wine they choose as being their favorite. What we've shown is that in short sequence length, so if the consumers sample 2 or 3 in the sequence, they're biased to prefer the first one that they sampled. We call this a primacy effect. But as the sequence length gets longer to 4 or 5, what we found is that now consumers are more biased to choose the last option in the sequence. We call this a recency effect. And in these studies, we actually showed all the same Rieslings. They were all the same, so the participants didn't know, and so it really was a bias. So that's something that could influence consumer perceptions that really shouldn't have an impact, but it does. Another study that I did recently, we looked at the sound of the name of the winery. Does the sound of the name influence how a consumer evaluates the taste of the wine? We brought participants into our lab and we gave them a glass of wine, and we told one group, the wine you're about to sample is from a winery called Titakis Winery. And you can see Titakis is very orthographically regular in the English language. It's very easy to pronounce. The second group was given the same glass of wine, but instead was told the wine that you're about to sample today is from a winery called Selepu Winery. And you can see here, this is a very odd letter combination for the English language. We don't usually see words beginning with two consonants together like that. So it's very difficult to pronounce for an English-speaking consumer. And we showed this in pre-test as well, that consumers rated these two as very different in terms of how easy they were to say. Well, what we found in this study is that the simple sound of the name of the winery influenced consumers' perception of the taste of the wine. So when it was more difficult to say, more difficult to pronounce, they thought that it was not only better quality, but that it tasted better. Okay, and this is, we hypothesized because consumers thought, well, maybe if it's more rare or difficult to pronounce, it might be more rare, it may be more valuable, so maybe it's going to be better quality. All right, so the third one that I want to go over is recent research that we did here in the lab that looks at the role of the perceived fit of a celebrity name to a wine. And especially if a celebrity is an athlete, you can imagine that some athletes in some sports might be perceived to be a better fit to the product category of wine. And certainly in our pre-tests, what our respondents said were things like, well, golf is very prestigious and luxurious kind of sport, but hockey is not as close of a match because it's more rough and it's more physical and it's not as perceived to be as luxurious, so that's not as close of a fit. And what we did is we brought people into the lab and got them to taste various wines that we told them were associated with different celebrity-sponsored athletes. And what we found is that if something was too close, so golf, for instance, something was too close, they weren't really interested. If something was very, very incongruent, like wrestling, also didn't do so well for consumer perceptions, but a sport that was somewhere in the middle, something like speed skating, where consumer kind of had to think, oh, well, this is interesting. It's not really what I expected, but it's not too far out of my expectations. That moderate level of fit was associated with the highest perceptions of the taste of the wine. And again, in these studies, we used the same wine and gave them a cover story. And so these factors, as well as the factors that you all mentioned earlier, are what we call cues that a consumer uses to make their judgment that are extrinsic or external to the product of wine. So these are things like the label, the name, the celebrity. These are all marketing-related cues that a consumer can use to form their judgment. And these cues are in contrast to what we call intrinsic cues. These are the actual ingredients of the product, so the grape varietal or where the wine is from. These are inherent to the product that if you alter these things, you're really altering the product itself. And so it's these kinds of extrinsic marketing-related cues that I am interested in studying in my research that I'll be presenting today. Just to give you a little bit more background of the kinds of research questions that I develop, I like to take a marketplace phenomenon, something that I might see occurs in the marketplace or a variable that's been altered or changed, and apply psychological theory to try to understand it through research. So I might bring that research into the lab or run a field experiment and try to understand what's happening in terms of the psychological mechanisms behind it. And from those discoveries, not only can I go back and try to inform basic psychological theory, but I can also then inform managerial or contribute to managerial decision-making in the industry. All right, so let me go through my theoretical framework of consumer decision-making that I want to first outline to break down the separate steps that a consumer might go through when making a decision about wine. So first we have the behavioral choice phase. So this is the phase that the consumer is at, maybe when they're at the LCBO or at a winery, and they're making a choice. So they haven't yet decided which wine they're going to buy or which wine they're going to consume later. And what I've shown you so far is that the order in which a wine is encountered or sampled has an influence on what they ultimately choose. So that's one variable that I've studied at this phase. The next stage is the consumption experience. So once the consumer has decided this is the wine that I'm going to have with my meal, or this is the wine that I'm going to buy and consume at a later occasion, I try to look at what are the influences of that, what are the subtle influences of variables in the environment on that consumption experience. And so far what I've shown you is that the simple sound of the winery name could influence a consumer's taste perception, and also the perceived fit or congruity between the athlete, sponsor, and the wine also have an impact on that stage. Finally, the third stage, this is the memory of the experience. This is when we think about word of mouth, and is a person going to remember and talk about us to their friends and family? And that's the third stage. I'm not going to talk about any of my research on that stage today, but what I will focus on is two streams of research on the first two stages. First is a stream of research I have on the influence of adding a winemaker's signature on the label of wine and the effect that that has on purchases. And the second stream of research that I'm going to talk about in the second half of my presentation today is the influence of a photo on the label of a wine and what impact that has on consumer decision making. So let me start off with the first stream of research on the effects of personal signatures on labels. When you look around in the marketplace, you notice that many product categories have signatures on packaging. Everything from Papa John's pizza marketing materials to cans of tonic water. You can see the signature there, and various different wineries also have the winemaker's signature visible on the label on the front or the back. And my colleague from the University of Miami, Carrie Kettle, and I questioned whether this presence of a signature could have an impact on consumer perceptions of the taste of the wine. Would it lead them to be more likely to buy the wine, and so on. And we took the signature, we examined the signature from the standpoint that it could be used as another extrinsic cue, another cue to quality that's external to the wine. So just like a consumer looks at the price, the brand name, any other aspects of a label, the signature could be another one of those branding elements that could influence their perception and may be more likely to make them want to buy it. And of course, consumers rely on these kinds of extrinsic cues because oftentimes, especially with wine, they don't have a chance to try it and taste it. And so they rely on these other marketing variables. So this could be very important. So I'm going to make two propositions today and explain the hypotheses that we came up with for this set of studies that I'll present. The first is that personal signatures act as a cue to quality for consumers. Okay, that's the first proposition. The second proposition I'll make, and I'll get into more details about this in a moment, is that the personal signature of a winemaker, for instance, serves as a cue to the consumer of that winemaker's identity. And to the extent to which the consumer can relate to that personal identity, they will be more likely to be influenced by that connection. So I'm going to spend more time talking about that second proposition. Let me talk first about this idea that personal signatures signal quality. We know from artists and craftsmen throughout the Italian Renaissance, artists like to put their name on their pieces of art. They'd like to indicate that this piece is something that was created by me, and it's a stamp, it's a signature to indicate quality. And of course, consumers use that signature to interpret the piece as being quality, as being authentic, and so on. And so this is something that we know is associated with quality throughout history. So that leads us to our first hypothesis in this set of studies, that personal signatures are perceived by the consumer as a signal to quality. Right? Now for our second proposition, the idea that signatures cue identity. Well, Carrie Kettle has previous research that shows that when a consumer signs his or her name, so imagine you sign your name on your credit card slip, on your income taxes, you sign your name, a few of the students who came in just signed your names at the door there. Well, Carrie's previous research shows that when a consumer signs his or her name, it activates or brings to mind identity-related thoughts for the consumer. So for example, when a Canadian consumer signs his or her name, they're more likely to follow up with choosing a Canadian versus an American product. And the idea here is that signing your name makes relevant or salient or brings to your mind associations of who you are as a person, and that makes you behave then consistently with that. So based on that, we took it a step further, and we suspected that if signing your own name brings to mind thoughts of your own identity, then if you see someone else sign their name, you might then start to think about that person's identity. Okay? And so because signatures are associated with identity, we took that a step further. So I have the Wayne Gretzky restaurant up there and the Wayne Gretzky signature. So let me build off about that idea and try to explain a little bit further. We thought that because a consumer might associate another person's signature with their identity, that if the consumer perceives that person's identity as being knowledgeable, credible, of high quality, then they might associate that person's signature with being high quality. But if they associate that person and that person's identity through their signature as being low quality, not as knowledgeable, maybe not as credible, then the signature might cue lower quality. Okay, let me build on that even further, and returning to the Wayne Gretzky example, when we suspected that when a consumer sees another person's signature and is cued to thinking about who that person is and any other associations of that person's identity, then related thoughts and ideas might come to mind. So for instance, seeing Wayne Gretzky's signature might cue other thoughts and images about Wayne Gretzky as being Canadian, for instance, being a hockey player, and so on. And we know from previous research that when a consumer thinks about identity, his or her own identity, that influences their consumption. And so by making the signer's identity salient and possibly making shared aspects of that signer's identity salient, like being Canadian, for instance, or being a hockey player, that might make the consumer be more likely to choose that product because of that similarity, because those shared aspects of their identity are brought to mind in that moment. And so that leads us to our third hypothesis, that when a consumer sees a personal signature of someone else, that activates their shared aspects of their identity, and that can influence consumption. So let me put these hypotheses together now into our model and just recap what I've said so far. First of all, we predict that when there's a signature on a label, it's going to influence consumer decision-making through their choice. But that effect of the signature on preference is mediated by perceptions of quality, because we hypothesize that the signature acts as a cue to quality. Moderated by that is the effect of the perceptions of the signer. So if the signer is perceived to be somebody of high quality, knowledgeable, and so on, then that's going to affect their perceptions of quality. And finally, our last point is that this effect of the signature and preference is moderated by the perceived shared identity between the signer and the consumer. All right, so let me start by describing our first study. And now this study was not a lab study. It was a little bit different than the experiments I presented earlier. This was actually a field investigation where we worked with our friends from Riverview Cellars in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I actually, Debbie mentioned that I'm a fitness instructor, so Mike Pilateri's wife is a fitness instructor who I work alongside. And I was chatting with her and Mike one day, and I said, you know, we've just run all these interesting studies where we're looking at the effects of signature on product labels. We've done it with pizza, we've done it with cheeses, and so on. We want to look at wine. And Mike was really fascinated, so when they were printing their Angelina's Reserve Chardonnay, he went ahead and put the winemaker Angela Casamoses' signature on the back of the label when they reprinted their Chardonnay bottles. And so I'm going to pass this around so that you can take a look. Angela is actually a CCOVI grad, so she's a winemaker there now, and she graduated from here. And so there's a nice connection there. And so we asked Mike, we thought, wow, this is great, because their Chardonnay from 2011, 2012 to 2013, it was the same price point, same tasting notes. It was a virtually identical wine. The major difference is that they added Angela's signature on the back. So we asked Mike, can we take a look at your sales data for 1 month as a proportion of overall store sales to see and compare the sales for when the Chardonnay did not have the signature on the label versus when it did have the signature on the label. So here are the data. This is these are the data for the sales for the Chardonnay as a proportion of the overall store sales for the month of February in 2011, 2012, and 2013. And what you can see there is that when the signature was added to the label, there was a significant increase in sales for the Chardonnay as a proportion of overall store sales. So this gave us initial evidence to suggest that the signature does play a role and it does influence consumer perceptions. So we went back to our friends at Riverview and we said, you know, we want to now run an experiment. We don't want to just observe the data. We want to run an experiment. So we came up with the idea to do an experiment on their 2012 Gewürztraminer. So this wine was featured in their Taste of the Season event. So this is an event that occurs every November in Niagara-on-the-Lake where there are many participating wineries. Consumers can buy a pass and then go to the participating wineries, visit them, taste the wine that they have featured, and Riverview had this one featured, so I'll pass this one around. And they can sample the wine and then sample some food that's paired with the wine. And what we worked with them on in terms of the experimental design is we wanted to somehow showcase the signature and manipulate whether the participants in this event saw the signature or not. And the way we did this was through a sign in the winery. And this event took place over several weeks, so we were able to examine the customers as a function of whether we showed this sign in the winery with the signature or not. So let me show you the timeline of how we made this happen. On the first week of the event, we didn't have any sign, so we could look at the sales of the Gewürztraminer based on whether, you know, there was no sign at all. On the second week, we displayed a very small 8.5 by 11 sign on the shelf next to the Gewürztraminer, just like this, and you can see that Angela Casamoses' name is present at the bottom, but we don't have her signature on the sign. On the third week, we had the exact same sign displayed with Angela's name, but in addition to that, we have Angela's signature. And so we wanted to see whether this simple addition of the signature on a sign impacted sales of the wine. And just to give you an idea of how this looks when you walk into Riverview Estates, you first walk into the winery and the tasting bar is on the right. And the event took place to the left in a separate tasting room. Okay, and as you can see, the wines are displayed on a shelf in the first room that a person might walk into, and that some of the wines have a sign and some of them don't, so it doesn't look unusual if the Gewürztraminer doesn't have a sign associated with it. And the Gewürztraminer was actually on display on one of the top shelves. Okay. And so here are the data. What you can see here is when we look at the sales for that weekend as a proportion of overall store sales in the month of November, because these were separate weeks in the month of November 2013, you can see there's a statistically significant increase in sales for the Gewürztraminer when the sign displayed a signature. Now I'm going to show you the data in a different way as a function of the number of visitors to the winery. So this graph shows the number of visitors that the winery had to participate in the Taste of the Season event, and the number of bottles of Gewürztraminer sold relative to the number of visitors. And again, what you can see here is that there is a statistically significant increase in sales in terms of the number of bottles sold. So taken together, the first two field studies gave us confidence that the signature does play a role. And through two field studies, which are typically difficult to conduct, we showed this effect, and so it replicated in the field. And we showed it in two ways. One is with the signature printed on the back of the label, and one is where we manipulated the signature on a sign that was removed from the actual bottle of wine. So now we wanted to take this idea into a controlled laboratory experiment to try to investigate it even further and look more in depth at what the psychological mechanisms are. Is this signature having an effect on perceptions of quality of the wine? Is there an influence on the perception of the signer and so on? These are questions that we could only answer by doing a laboratory study. So what we did in the next study is we wanted to test these next two hypotheses on quality and perceptions of signer. But in addition, we wanted to rule out the idea that maybe somehow consumers think that the winemaker touched it or hand selected it, and maybe that leads to a perception of scarcity, and maybe that's what's driving the effect. So we wanted to separate that personal touch theory out from our hypotheses. And we ran this study in a lab setting, and we chose two different winery names, Fetzer wines and Florio wines. And we had the winemaker's signature, the winemaker's names here, and we manipulated their signatures on the label. And by doing it this way and running it in the lab, we were able to ask our respondents about their perceptions of the winemaker, so we can get a sense of the influence or the role of the perceptions of the signer. This experiment used signature versus no signature, using stimuli that looked like this, displayed on the computer screen. And so you can see here when there was no signature, and we photoshopped these to look realistic, there was no signature displayed versus having the winemaker's signature displayed. And here's the other example of the wine, and this is how it looked to participants. In terms of the experimental design, we had 4 experimental conditions. And in these conditions, we manipulated not just the signature, but whether the respondents thought that the wine was hand-selected by the winemaker. So I'll just run you through these 4 experimental conditions. In the one condition, we just showed the wine. We didn't give any information. There was no signature. They just saw it and were asked to make a judgment. Next, in the next condition, we did not have a signature shown, but we mentioned that the bottle was hand-selected by the winemaker. In the third experimental condition, there was a signature, but there was nothing else mentioned. And finally, in the fourth condition, there was the signature, but also the respondents were told that this wine was hand-selected. So we want to look at these effects on the perceptions of quality. So here are the data for perceptions of quality as a function of whether we told them that the wine was hand-selected or hand-touched or not hand-touched. And you can see here at the bottom that the data on the right show the quality ratings for when there was a signature. And you can see that what matters here is whether there was a signature or not. Ratings of quality were higher when there was a signature on the label versus when there was no signature. But there was no difference in perceptions of quality if we told them that this was hand-selected. So what this shows is that the signature has a big impact, and it doesn't lead to change, or that if the consumers think that it was more likely to be hand-selected, that really made no difference. What mattered was the impact of the signature. Doing the lab study also allowed us to test our model statistically, and what we found by analyzing the data was that there was a direct effect of personal signature on preference of the wine that was mediated by perceptions of quality. And that mediation was moderated by perceptions of the signer. So if the respondents thought that the signer was knowledgeable, credible, and of higher quality, then they thought that the wine was high quality, and they were more likely to choose it. Okay. All right, so this was our first lab study, but we thought we should go back to Riverview and do another experiment to see and test this in a different way, just to see if we can replicate it, and also to examine this role of identity, which we haven't investigated yet. And so we went back and we tried to figure out a way that we could examine identity, but look at actual consumption and see if people are actually buying the wine. And so we decided to investigate or do an experiment rather with their newly released Malbec. And just like the Chardonnay and Gewürztraminer, this wine has Angela Casamos's signature printed on the back label. So this was the focus of our next experiment, and I'll pass this around for you to take a look at. So how we did this study is we actually ran our own tasting event. We brought people, we advertised an event that was showcasing a new release. This was the Malbec. We ran this last March. And we brought people into the lab, into the winery, into the separate tasting room that's on the side of the winery. And we poured a glass of the Malbec for people to taste and enjoy. And we showed them a little card, without showing the bottle that I'm passing around. We showed them a little card that had the label printed on the card. So this is all that they could see if they came to participate in our event. And this is also shown up here on the screen. What you'll notice about this is that it's a reprint of the label that does not have Angela Casamos's signature on the back. And we gave this to respondents who came on the first Saturday, and we asked them to answer some questions about the wine. So I'll pass this around for you to take a look at. On the following Saturday, we ran the exact same event and showcased the Malbec, brought people into the tasting room, just like we did on the previous Saturday. Only this time, the card that we gave our visitors was identical, except that we showed Angela Casamos's signature printed on it. So as they're tasting the wine, they could see the label and they could answer some questions about the wine for us. And we told them that if you answer a couple questions for us as part of our event today, you can receive a $2 discount if you bring that card to the cash and presented at the cash. So the cashier, actually that was me because I was working undercover that day as the cashier, and I collected those and I stapled them to their receipts so that I could track what they bought on those 2 Saturdays, and it was a lot of fun. Now the questions that are on that card that's being passed around, I'll also show it on the screen in a moment, asks just simple things that we might ask in our lab studies. How much do you like the wine? How would you rate the quality of the wine? They're answered on a scale. And also, where are you from? And how old are you? Because we wanted to see where our visitors were from. This is how the card looks up close, and what you'll notice, this is the version with Angela's signature. The only difference between the 2 cards is that the one with the signature has her signature and there's the word signature in it, and the card without the signature has a space there and doesn't mention her signature. Okay, but otherwise the questions and everything else are the same. All right, so I just want to also show you the setup in the winery. As I mentioned, the event was held in a separate tasting room to the left, and we did not have the bottles of Malbec displayed in that tasting room. What's interesting about this field experiment is that if a consumer wanted to then go and buy the Malbec, they actually had to come back in this room, find it on the shelf, it was over here in the middle, and pick it up from the shelf over here. So it's a very strong test of our hypothesis, because they actually had to go into a separate room to pick this wine up and purchase it. In addition, what we're interested in and why we asked where they're from and what we were looking for in terms of our predictions is we wanted to see where people were from. Riverview Estates is situated right on the Niagara River. So there are a lot on the Canadian side. There are a lot of visitors from all areas of Ontario we found, from Peterborough, Brampton, even Fort Erie, Thunder Bay, all areas of Ontario. But equally likely were visitors from right across the river in Buffalo, New York, even in other areas of the US, Ohio, Michigan, and other adjacent US cities. And so we wanted to analyze not the geographical distance, but rather which side of the border were they from, because this was a really neat location to analyze our visitors for. All right, so here are the data. First, as we showed in our previous studies, the presence of the signature on the label was associated with an increase in quality perception. So this replicates our earlier finding. We're very happy about that. But when we look at the number of bottles of Malbec sold, we also see a statistically significant increase in sales, a sales increase of 500%, which our friends at Riverview were really, really happy about. This was something that we did not expect, but this was a huge increase in sales. So these numbers show the number of bottles sold relative to the number of visitors to the winery that day. And I just want to point out that the first Saturday in March where we ran this experiment, the Saturday that we had no signature on the label was a beautiful, sunny, bright day, kind of like today. And on the day that we ran the signature condition, it was actually rainy and cloudy and quite miserable. And we kind of see that with our numbers. We had fewer visitors to the winery on that day. But despite that, we still saw an increase in sales of the wine. Now what happens when we look more in depth at this idea of shared identity? We broke the data down into people who were from the region, from Southern Ontario. So these are people who have shared identity with the winemaker, highlighted in red here, versus the people who don't necessarily perceive a shared identity with the winemaker. So these are people from the US. And what we found is that our finding of the increase in sales for the Malbec occurred for the people who were locally here from Ontario. And so this provided support for our hypothesis that it's the shared aspects of the identity made salient through the signature that influence the effect, that have an impact on preference. So going back to our mediation model, we had the data to analyze this model, and what we show here, replicating our previous studies, is that the presence of the personal signature does have an impact on consumer choice, and that is mediated by perceptions of quality. But in addition to that, we found that this effect was moderated by the shared identity, the perceived shared identity between the consumer and the signer. So that when there was a shared identity, there was an effect, and when there was no shared identity, we did not see an effect. Right? So we ran one additional experiment that just allowed us to replicate and give us confidence that it is the identity, the identity-related thoughts that matter for consumers when they look at a signature. We did this study a little bit differently. We ran this on Amazon Turk. This is an online research system where respondents in the United States can participate in studies and get paid for them. And we chose cheese because we wanted, and this is Organic Valley sources from farmers from all different states. So it allowed us to try to manipulate perceived identity of the farmer. When respondents agreed to participate in the study, we asked them to indicate some demographic information. How old are you? Where were you born? And so on. And so some people wrote that, for instance, they're from California, or they're from Iowa, or they're from Connecticut. And what we did in the experiment then for the cheese is we either told them that the cheese is signed by a farmer from whatever state the person, if the person entered California, then we put that in as the state that the farmer was from. So that was the experimental condition. We told them that the farmer was from the same state as them. Or in the control condition, we just told them the farmer was from Wisconsin. In addition to that, we measured their strength of state identity. As you can imagine, some people, if they're from a state and they grew up in that state and they still live in that state, they may really strongly identify with being from that state. Whereas others might move away from that state at some point, live in a different culture, and not really strongly identify with being from that state. So that's why it was important for us to measure on a scale how strongly our respondents identify with the state from which they're from. Okay? So from doing that, we did a similar study. We got them to rate the cheeses and pick which cheese they would prefer. We replicated our earlier findings where the signature had an effect on preference, but we showed that this is moderated by strength of state identity. So when people really strongly identified with being from California, for example, if we told them the farmer was from California and they saw a signature, they were likely to pick that cheese. Okay? But if they were told the farmer's from California and they rated that they don't really strongly identify with being from California, so they got below 7 out of 10 on that scale, we showed them a signature, it didn't really have an impact on them in terms of their preference. Okay, so in summary, what I've shown you for the first set of studies that I'm presenting today is that the personal signature of a winemaker on a label is associated with enhanced quality perceptions on the part of the consumer. And again, these aren't celebrities, these aren't celebrity endorsements, these aren't autographs. This is just a simple signature of a winemaker, like the examples I passed around. And that this effect is moderated by perceptions of the signer. So if the signer is perceived to be high quality, then there are going to be high quality perceptions. And finally, this effect has to do with the perceived shared identity between the person who signs and the consumer. Okay, so there's an important boundary condition of this finding. It's not that we can put a signature on a label and everyone's going to like it and everyone's going to buy it. It's only relevant and noticed and of importance to consumers who can see and witness and be affected by that personal connection through the shared identity that's perceived between the signer and themselves as a consumer. All right. And so this has implications for other areas in marketing as well. I didn't get to present our other studies, but we did a number of studies with cheeses. We've done it with pizza, we've done it with clothing, and various product categories. And so time and time again, what we've shown is that seeing a signature on a label has an influence on consumers when there's a shared identity. So that's the takeaway for the first set of studies. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the second stage of consumer decision making that I outlined at the beginning, the consumer experience stage, or what are some of the factors that impact how a consumer perceives a taste of a wine. And I want to go back to this idea of photos on labels, because when you walk through the LCBO, you see that there are many labels that have an image associated with the name of the wine. So pond view, and a picture of a pond, a view of a pond, or leaning post, and there's a picture of a leaning post. And so this made us question what the impact might be on consumer perceptions of this simple photo. So what I'm going to do is a little experiment with you guys here today. So I'm going to have group 1 here on my right, and then group 2. And the people who are watching online, you can be in group 1 if you'd like. And so I'm going to show you a statement here. And so I'm just going to ask group 2 to just close your eyes or look away, look outside for a minute. Don't look at what's on the screen. Group 1 and people online, I want you to raise your hand if you think the statement I'm going to show on the left of this screen is true. If you think it's true, raise your hand and I'll get a count. All right? So here it is. If you think it's true, raise your hand. Okay, I've got my count. Now group 2, you can relax. And I'm going to do the same for you. Raise your hand if you think this statement is true. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, thank you very much. So it's 0 for when there's no picture, and 7 when there is a picture associated with the question. And that's exactly what this group of researchers from New Zealand reported in a set of experiments where they asked their respondents, true or false, turtles are deaf. And they show a picture of a turtle. People think it's true, right? You don't show a picture of a turtle, you kind of think, I don't know. You don't have as many images associated coming to mind. You're kind of struggling with any thoughts you might think you know about the topic and so on. And this idea of having something come to mind and feel familiar and have images coming to your mind, this is the idea of conceptual fluency. This is the relative ease or difficulty of bringing to mind related thoughts, images, and associations. And so group 1, when you didn't have a photo, it was pretty disfluent. It was kind of hard to process, and you're trying to make sense of what it was. Maybe, have you seen this before? I'm not sure. Seemed very unfamiliar, right? And usually when something is unfamiliar to you, you think, I've never seen this before, I've never heard of this before. Okay, this is a trivia question, it's probably not true. On the other hand, the other group, when you see a photo, that gives you that added familiarity. You start to think of any other related thoughts or associations that might come to your mind that helps you make sense of what it is you're judging. It helps you feel more familiar about what it is you're making the judgment about. And it's this theoretical framework that led us to this research question about whether the presence of a photo on a label might also make consumers make sense of the wine and what they think they might know about the wine and any kind of familiarity they might have towards the wine, and make them more likely to want to buy it or think that it tastes better. And so this led us to our hypothesis that consumers will give higher evaluations to a wine if it's associated with a photo versus no photo. Very simple experiment that I did with this group of researchers from New Zealand. We ran a set of studies that I'll describe in a moment where we told our participants that we're going to show you some wines today that were involved in a California wine competition. Some of these wines won a gold medal, some of them didn't. So it's your task today to let us know whether you think this wine won a gold medal or not. And how we did this is we came up with, and there was no California wine competition, and all of these wines were made up names. We paired an adjective with a noun, and we showed a label either without, a very plain label, either without a photo or with an accompanying photo that depicted whatever the name of the wine was. And I should point out that we've run this study in many different ways. First, we did it with what looked like labels, and so we had the full label with the photo or the full label without. And we thought, well, maybe with the photo, it looks like they put more marketing dollars into it, and maybe that might lead them to think that it might be perceived as lower quality if there was no photo. So we ran it in various ways, and one way is what I'm showing on the screen, where it doesn't really look like there's more marketing dollars, because they both, whether it has no photo or with a photo, they both look very plain and not associated with a higher marketing budget. So what we did in our first experiment that I'm going to present today in this line of work is we had participants respond from Amazon Mechanical Turk. So this is the same online group of respondents I mentioned earlier from the US, where people can answer some questions and get paid for that online. We did an experiment where we showed the labels, like I showed you earlier, either with a photo or without a photo. And we had two groups of participants online. So at random, our respondents were assigned to either the group where they were asked to judge whether the wines of this California wine competition were high quality. So we showed them the labels and they answered true or false to the statement, this was a high quality wine. Okay, so that was one group of respondents. The second group of respondents saw the same thing, wine labels with a photo or without, but we changed the question. Instead of asking them to respond true or false to the statement that the wine was high quality, we instead asked them to respond true or false to the statement of whether the wine was low quality. Now let me explain why that's really important. That was a really important experimental condition to add. We hypothesized that the photo is associated with additional thoughts and images and familiarity associated with the wine, and that makes them think the wine is higher quality, because these are all good feelings and good associations. If, on the other hand, this effect has nothing to do with conceptual fluency and the feeling that you felt earlier, if instead it's the case that you could ask people anything negative, they're just more likely to say yes if there's a photo. If they're just more likely to say yes, that's true, regardless of the question, then you could ask them a negative question and they'll still say yes, it's true, 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 true. Okay, so that's why it was important to have these two experimental conditions to really test our hypothesis about conceptual fluency. So here are the data. So what I'm going to show you is the proportion of true responses. First, for the statement, this wine was rated as high quality. So you'll see the proportion of true for when we showed the wine with a photo or without a photo. And what you can see is that there is a statistically significant increase in the number of responses to the positive statement when there was a photo versus no photo. Now, what happens when we ask them about the negative statement? When we change the question, so for the other group, and ask them whether the wine was rated as low quality. Well, when we ask them that question, they're not more likely to say yes with a photo. There's no statistically significant difference between the proportions for when there was a photo versus no photo. So this leads us to conclude that the photo on the label makes people come up with associated thoughts and images and familiarity, and helps them make sense of the name, and that makes them think it's better. In our next experiment in this line of work, we wanted to do an actual tasting study. We wanted to test whether presence of a photo on a label actually changed what consumers thought the wine tasted like. Now, does this have an effect on consumer taste perceptions? So we brought respondents into the lab. So that's a picture of our consumer perception and cognition lab that we have here on campus. Just off campus, part of CCOVI. And the participants were students and members of the Brock community here in Niagara, and they came in to do a tasting study. And our experimental design for this study is we showed some wines paired with a label with a photo, and other wines were shown without a photo, and they were then given the wine to taste as they made their quality judgments. And in this experiment, we only had the one group. We only asked respondents to make the judgments about whether the wine was high quality. And we replicated our earlier findings. So the findings look identical to what we showed earlier in the non-tasting study. So this gave us more evidence that the presence of a photo was associated with perceptions of quality. So just want to summarize quickly these photo experiments. Taken together, we've shown that consumers think the wine is higher quality, and it's not just a bias for them to say yes to anything, because it only occurs when we ask them a positive statement, when we ask them about whether the wine is high quality. And in addition, it's not just that they are more likely to think it's higher quality and it won an award, but they think it tastes better. And I should point out that the wines we used for the photo and no photo conditions in this study were exactly the same. They were both CCOVI student wines that were produced that Andy Reynolds gave us to use in this research. So they were exactly the same wine, so there was no other difference except for the photo, the presence of the photo on the label. Right? So in summary, for the two streams of research that I've presented today, what I've shown you are a couple of different factors that could influence a consumer's behavioral choice. So in their initial stage of consumer decision making, I've shown you that the order in which the wines are sampled and whether or not there's a signature on a label can have an impact on which wine they choose and which wine they buy. For the second stage of consumer decision making, I showed you some previous research that the sound of the name of the wine or the celebrity name fit to the wine could have an impact. And finally, whether there's a photo or not on the label has an impact on how a consumer thinks the wine tastes. And I would be happy to answer any questions or talk to anybody later about any studies on memory, but I didn't talk about any of those today. What I want you to take away from today's presentation are three key takeaway messages. and this is based on the kinds of questions that I usually get from people from the industry, such as, do you think I should just add a signature on all my labels? Well, what I suggest, the first takeaway message is that consumer research is really important and can really help us understand how consumers feel, what are they thinking, and what are they likely to buy. And as I showed you with our experiments that we did with Riverview Estates, it's pretty simple to run a simple experiment, whether it's in the winery or in the lab or online, to get a sense of how consumers perceive the label change, or who are the consumers. Does this label change have an impact on local consumers only? Does this label change have an impact on only knowledgeable consumers and not more casual consumers? These are the kinds of questions that can easily be answered through research like the research I presented to you today. And I strongly suggest that anyone interested should just do some studies, and I'd be happy to work with anyone on designing some studies. The second point is that one of the main takeaways is that these are really subtle influences. These subtle influences, these subtle label changes, like the addition of a signature, can have an impact on consumers and what they buy. You know, something as simple as a picture on a label can have an impact. And so these are things that you might not have considered before to have an impact, and there are so many more we have yet to study. And finally, when we find these results of these subtle influences, there are very important boundary conditions. So these are not something that we can do for everyone or that are going to affect every consumer. There are important situations and conditions in which these changes have an impact, and other situations where they don't. So it's important to understand what these boundary conditions are. All right, thank you everyone for coming today and for watching online, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
So we have a full house here today, and we've got time for questions, so we open up the floor.
Yes?
For this signature, have you done any research to see about maybe a proprietor's signature? So in the event of things like Pilotary, where the winery is a family name, if the owner's name is also signed on the bottle, have you done any research with that, or is that a place that you're thinking of taking this?
Okay, so the question, I just want to repeat it for the online viewers, is whether and also just make sure I understand the question, is have we looked at the difference between the winemaker's signature versus the proprietor's signature? And no, we have not looked at that. That is something that we do want to look at as a next step, because that might also have an impact. And how many signatures could we potentially put on a label as well? So no, we have not looked at that, but that's a really interesting and important question that we could easily study in the lab or at the winery that we haven't looked at yet. Yes, there's another question, yes?
I recently came across a wine label with nutritional content information, and I mean, wine labels aren't required to state this, so I interpret it as a marketing cue. I wonder if you have any ideas on whether or not that has any positive or negative impacts on consumer perception.
Okay, so the question is whether nutritional labels on wine packaging, which we typically don't see in packaging for wine, if that could have an impact on consumer decision making. Now, there's a whole new literature in consumer psychology that looks at the impact on nutritional labels, and I would suspect that if we could, generate some hypotheses of what might happen for wine based on what happens for regular consumer packaged foods, and I don't know actually what that might be, because there might be a confound there. One is that there's the nutritional information in and of itself, but the other thing is the fact that the wine in and of itself might stand out because it's the only one, and I'm sure that might have happened for you, that wine stood out because you're not used to seeing this information on a wine label. So that might also be something that might have an impact, but that's something that could be studied as well. Yes. Yes.
If you don't mind, I can help with that question. I'm a food scientist. I also work in a lot of food labelings as well. Wine and most of the liquors are not required to have nutrition labeling. One of the problems, when I say problems, is because in nutrition labelings you have to talk about calorie, and alcohol has a very high calorie. So you don't want the customer to say, oh my goodness, makes me really fat.
Let me just repeat that point for the viewers online. So we have a food scientist in the audience, and he said that one of the reasons maybe why we don't have nutrition labels on wine labels is that wine is very high calorie, and that might deter consumers from purchasing.
It's not required by the...
And it's not required.
It's not required, not because of that, but it's just not, usually liquors are,
Right.
liquors and a couple of other products are exceptions, because it's not required.
Right.
But nobody tries to even voluntarily put it forward.
Yeah, very interesting. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Have you looked at the difference between putting the signature on the front label versus the back label?
We have not. When we look at because other wineries have used the signatures, the winemaker signatures on their labels, and some do have it in the front and some do have it in the back, but we have yet to. It would be great if we could work with the LCBO perhaps and track sales to see if there is a difference, if all else is equal, to look at that, but we have not looked at that yet. That's a very good question though. Yes?
This is a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if the bottle would be hand signed versus printed, that could make an effect.
Yeah, the difference of whether the wine is hand signed versus printed was something that we tried to get at in our study of being hand selected versus just signed. And based on the results of that study, I would think that if it's not a celebrity and if it's not an autograph, that it shouldn't make a difference. But having said that, there might be situations where the wine is signed by a celebrity or by somebody who is perceived to be more of an autograph, and that might have an impact, but for different reasons than what I've shown today, because that's more of an autograph as opposed to a signature. So that could have an impact as well. Any other questions?
Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Antonia for a wonderful talk today.
Thank you.
Many more questions to look at. So
great. Thank you so much.
We're forward to future research there. And before we go, just a reminder, we have our very last lecture coming up on April 7th. It is Gary Pickering. He is one of our CCOVI researchers within the Institute, and his topic is SNPs, Snobs, and Snouts: the influence of biology, expertise, and taste and wine preference segmentation of North American consumers. So we look forward to seeing you all next week, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.